Your heart speaks the truth, my sweet mate. Did you really think a shallow grave could hide you from me?
I thought fated Mark was a death sentence. I didn't know he was willing to break the world just to keep me.
I swallowed the bitter poison, praying the freezing dirt would hide my scent. My father swore to the Alpha King that the mountain fever had already taken me. I held my breath in the dark, listening to his heavy boots pace directly above my shallow grave. Then, the ancient oak floorboards shattered above my head. He didn't bring an army to punish my treason. He reached into the dirt, his breathtakingly handsome face pale with a terrifying, unyielding devotion. Your heart speaks the truth, my sweet mate, he whispered, pulling me into his warm chest. I thought his fated Mark was an inescapable death sentence. I didn't know the king was willing to bleed out his own ancient magic, just to keep hearing my pulse. Welcome to Luna's secret library. Sometimes the most unexpected turns lead us exactly where we need to be. What happens next is something I never saw coming, and I think you'll find it just as surprising. Stick around for the conclusion. It's a reminder that it's never too late for a new chapter. If you enjoy discovering these hidden gems, I'd be honored to have you follow for more. The damp earth smelled of rot, old pine, and the suffocating scent of my own fear. I pressed my trembling palms against the frozen dirt walls of my narrow hiding place, willing my body to become as lifeless as the grave I was occupying. Above my head, the heavy oak floorboards of the abandoned hunting lodge groaned under a familiar, uneven weight. It was my father's step, hesitant and burdened with the terrible lie he was about to tell. Beside him, however, came a sound that made the blood in my veins turn to absolute ice. Measured, heavy, and echoing with an undeniable authority. The boots of King Gideon, the Alpha of the Northern Territories, struck the wooden floor like a judge's gavel. My father's voice trembled through the tiny cracks in the floorboards. She is gone, Your Grace. He whispered, his tone thick with a carefully manufactured grief that almost sounded real. The mountain fever took her 3 nights ago. We buried her by the river before the wild wolves could find her. I held my breath, clenching my jaw so tightly that my teeth ached. The dark, bitter potion I had swallowed hours ago was supposed to slow my pulse to a mere whisper, an ancient brew explicitly designed to mimic the absolute finality of death. For 3 agonizing days, my family had meticulously prepared this deception to save me from his royal claim. The Alpha King did not answer immediately. The silence in the small, dusty cabin grew incredibly heavy, suffocating, and thick with an unbearable tension. I could hear the slow, deliberate rustle of his massive fur cloak as he moved. He walked across the room, his heavy footsteps stopping directly above my chest. Loose dust filtered down through the narrow gaps in the wood, landing softly on my pale, cold cheeks. I closed my eyes tightly, praying silently to the ancestors for the absolute stillness of stone. You bury your dead remarkably quickly, Lord Thomas, Gideon finally spoke. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that vibrated through the floorboards and deep into my very bones. It carried no obvious anger, only a terrifying, preternaturally calm certainty that sent shivers down my spine. The earth by the river is frozen completely solid this time of year, the king continued, his boots shifting slightly on the wood above me. Yet, your iron shovel leaning against the wall is completely clean. There is absolutely no mud on your boots, nor the smell of wet clay on your clothes. We used the old iron spade, my lord, my father stammered desperately, his panic rapidly rising as the king dismantled his story. We threw hot coals on the frozen ground to soften the earth before digging. Please, Your Grace, you must believe me. My daughter is dead. A sudden, razor-sharp silence followed his plea. Then, I heard the distinct sound of Gideon inhaling deeply. He was catching the scent of the room, filtering the stale air through his lethal, superhuman senses. I squeezed my eyes shut, realizing with mounting horror that my own body was betraying me. Despite the potent potion, despite my absolute terror and rigid stillness, my heart gave a sharp, frantic thud against my ribs. It was a single, desperate pulse of life in a room built on lies. Above me, the king's footsteps stopped completely. "Do you hear that, Thomas?" Gideon murmured, his voice dropping to a dangerous, silken whisper that commanded the entire room. "Hear what, Your Grace?" "There is absolutely nothing. But the winter wind," my father lied one final time. "The wind does not possess a rhythm," Gideon said smoothly. "The wind does not sound like a frightened bird hopelessly trapped in a dark cage." Before my father could utter another desperate excuse, a deafening crack shattered the quiet of the cabin. The Alpha King did not bother looking for a hidden latch or a secret door. He simply drove his iron-toed boots straight through the ancient, thick oak planks. Splinters rained down on my face, sharp edges cutting into my cheek. Blinding light flooded my dark sanctuary, shattering my illusion completely. Through the jagged hole in the floor, two golden, piercing eyes locked instantly onto mine. Gideon knelt, his massive, imposing frame blocking out the pale winter light. His face was a breathtaking mask of cold, unyielding possession. "A very clever trick, Eleanor," he said softly, his intense gaze scanning my trembling, dirt-streaked form. He reached down, his large, heavily calloused hands gripping the broken edges of the solid wood. With a single, effortless pull of his terrifying strength, he ripped the heavy floorboards apart as if they were made of fragile paper. The entire floor gave way, fully exposing my shallow grave to the freezing winter air. My father fell to his knees in the background, weeping openly in absolute terror for his life. But the king did not even spare him a single glance. Gideon reached into the dark pit, his powerful arms wrapping securely around my waist, lifting me into the light, completely ignoring my weak attempts to push him away. "You are a remarkably poor liar, my sweet mate," he whispered against my ear, his touch surprisingly gentle against my skin. "Your heart speaks the truth, even when your family swears you are already in the grave." The harsh ride to the winter spire was a terrifying blur of freezing wind and absolute, suffocating silence. Gideon held me securely against his broad chest, keeping me wrapped tightly in the heavy warmth of his dark wolf-skin cloak. I stubbornly refused to look at him, keeping my tear-filled eyes fixed firmly on the passing white wilderness. The core conflict between us was not a simple matter of petty pride or a rebellion against family duty. It was a desperate battle for my very survival, a frantic flight from a horrifying destiny that had haunted the women of my bloodline for generations. The massive black horses tore through the deep snow, carrying us further and further away from the only home I had ever known. With every passing mile, the crushing reality of my failure settled over my frail shoulders like a heavy iron chain. When we finally arrived at the massive, imposing stone fortress, the king dismounted easily and carried me effortlessly through the towering iron gates. The grand courtyard was filled with armed, disciplined guards and curious noble courtiers. The palace servants bowed in complete, stunned silence, their eyes wide with profound shock at my sudden, living appearance in the king's arms. They had all been officially told that their future queen had succumbed to a tragic illness, yet here I was, breathing, trembling, and captured. I braced myself to be thrown into a dark dungeon or a cold prison cell, as I had grimly expected for committing treason. Instead, Gideon marched straight past the grand throne room and violently kicked open the heavy double doors to the grandest suite in the eastern tower. He walked toward the center of the lavish room and placed me surprisingly gently on a massive four-poster bed covered in thick layers of soft, pale silk and heavy furs. The striking contrast between his raw, violent strength and this incredibly delicate treatment confused my racing mind. "Stay right here," he commanded softly, raising a large hand to brush a stray, damp lock of hair from my forehead. I jerked my head away from his touch instantly, my chest heaving as my eyes burned with unshed tears and fierce defiance. "You cannot keep me here against my will, Gideon," I said firmly, intentionally using his given name without his required royal title. I faked my own death because I would rather be a rotting ghost hidden in the dirt than survive as your captive. "You are not my captive, Eleanor," he replied evenly, his deep voice entirely devoid of the anger I expected, yet full of an unbreakable, ancient authority. "You are my chosen queen, marked by fate itself. The moon goddess herself tied our threads together before we were even born." The moon did not bother to ask for my consent, I spat back bitterly, pushing myself up to sit aggressively against the soft pillows. "My family has spent generations desperately fleeing from the dark shadow of your crown, and for very good reason." Gideon sighed softly, walking slowly toward the large stone hearth, entirely ignoring my sharp insults. He picked up a heavy pine log and tossed it into the dying, glowing embers, watching the sparks rise swiftly into the dark chimney. The fire sparked to life quickly, casting long, dancing, golden shadows across his sharp, aristocratic jawline and broad, muscular shoulders. "Your father lied straight to the face of his reigning king," Gideon said softly, his back still turned to me as he watched the flames. "By the ancient, unforgiving laws of our kind, his life rightfully belongs to the executioner's axe for committing such brazen treason." My breath caught painfully in my throat, a sudden wave of cold dread washing over my skin, momentarily replacing my anger with pure terror. "He only did it to save me," I whispered desperately, my voice immediately losing its sharp, combative edge. "He knew I was terrified. You cannot punish a desperate father for simply trying to protect his only child." Gideon turned around slowly, his intense golden eyes vividly reflecting the amber glow of the firelight. "I know his reasons, Eleanor," he said simply, his gaze locking onto mine. "That is precisely why I left him breathing in his cabin instead of tearing his throat out. But let this be absolutely clear to you right now. If you ever try to run from me again, there will be no mercy for him." He walked slowly back to the bedside, looming over me like a beautiful, incredibly dangerous mountain of muscle and lichen power. "Your life is entirely mine now. Not to destroy, not to punish, but to fiercely cherish and protect at all costs." "I do not want your cursed protection," I said, forcing myself to hold his intense, burning gaze. Despite my violently trembling hands, "Every woman who wears your royal ring ultimately becomes a helpless prisoner to your shadow, eventually fading away into nothing." Gideon leaned down deliberately, placing his large, heavy hands on the mattress on either side of my shoulders, trapping me entirely in his space. His intoxicating scent, crushed pine needles, fresh winter snow, and something fiercely, overwhelmingly male, flooded my senses completely. "Then teach me exactly how to be light for you instead of a shadow," he whispered huskily, his lips hovering mere inches from mine. "But do Not ever ask me to let you go. I heard your frantic heartbeat under those floorboards, Eleanor. It belongs to me now. The grand, cavernous hall of the Winter Spire was heavily filled with the rich, intoxicating scent of roasted meats, fresh pine garlands, and heavy, spiced wine. It was the night of the annual winter feast, a massive celebration where the most powerful lords of the Northern Territories had gathered to pledge their loyalty. Gideon had forced me to attend, making me sit beside him on the high, intimidating double throne, publicly claiming my place for the entire kingdom to see. I was meticulously dressed in a breathtaking, intricate gown of deep emerald velvet, which felt heavy and suffocatingly luxurious against my pale skin. The elaborate, ancient gold necklace secured tightly around my throat felt less like royal jewelry and far more like a gilded, inescapable collar, clearly marking me as his personal property. Throughout the incredibly long, exhausting evening, the visiting lords and ambitious nobles repeatedly raised their golden goblets, toasting to the king and his miraculously recovered fated mate. I kept my expression perfectly frozen, maintaining an impenetrable mask of aristocratic indifference, stubbornly refusing to drink from my cup or offer them a single smile. Every time a smirking noble bowed low to me, I felt a sharp, agonizing pang of anxiety tightening fiercely in my chest. They did not know the horrifying truth behind my presence on this throne. They only saw a triumphant king who had successfully claimed his ultimate prize. When the deafening feast finally began to wind down, Gideon stood up abruptly, dismissing the lingering court with a careless wave of his powerful hand. He silently led me away from the noisy, suffocating hall, guiding me down a series of quiet, torch-lit corridors toward the stunning glass conservatory located at the back of the ancient castle. The massive room was incredibly warm, deeply filled with exotic, lush green plants and vibrant blooming flowers that brazenly defied the freezing, deadly winter raging just outside the glass walls. Bright moonlight poured beautifully through the transparent ceiling, perfectly illuminating the delicate petals and the winding stone pathways. You played the part of a cold, beautifully distant queen perfectly. Tonight, Gideon noted quietly, leaning casually against an intricately carved stone pillar. It is not a part one I'm playing for your amusement, I replied sharply, wrapping my arms defensively around myself as I stared out at the heavy, blinding snow falling against the glass roof. I am cold. Because I am hopelessly trapped in a waking nightmare. Why won't you just let me go and find another mate? The single, devastating core conflict between us could no longer be hidden behind walls of polite silence or veiled royal threats. Gideon pushed off the pillar and walked slowly toward me, his heavy boots making deliberate, echoing sounds on the stone floor, stopping just inches away from my trembling form. Because you are desperately running from a shadow that simply does not exist, he said softly, gently reaching out a large hand to touch my cheek. It does exist. I snapped violently, swatting his hand away and turning to face him fully, years of repressed anger and terror finally boiling completely over. You honestly think I willingly hid under those filthy, rotting floorboards and drank a poisonous potion because of some childish whim? I took a shaky breath, my heart pounding against my ribs. I found my grandmother's hidden journals, Gideon. I read exactly what happened to the unfortunate women who came before me. My voice cracked. Suddenly, the raw, ugly emotion of my deepest, darkest fear exposing itself to him completely. Every single woman of my bloodline who accepted the Alpha King's fated bond died in agony before their 25th year. The immense, unnatural power of your royal crown, the overwhelming, untamed intensity of your lichen magic, it literally burns us from the inside out. I took a stumbling step back, my hands trembling uncontrollably as I pointed an accusing, shaking finger to my own delicate collarbone. Beneath the elegant, expensive fabric of my velvet dress, the faint silver mark of our fated mate bond was already glowing with a warm, terrifying magical heat. The lunar mark on our skin becomes a fatal, unbreakable curse, literally consuming our mortal life force simply to sustain your royal lineage and power. My father didn't hide me in the dirt to insult your pride or challenge your absolute rule, I whispered, hot tears finally spilling over my lashes and blurring my vision. He hid me because he didn't want to helplessly watch his only daughter wither away into nothing and die for your cursed throne. Gideon stood entirely, unnaturally still, his bright golden eyes widening in profound shock as the horrible, devastating truth finally registered in his mind. The fierce, possessive anger and dominant authority that usually defined his expression dissolved instantly, rapidly replaced by a profound, agonizing sorrow that aged him by decades. He did not look like a ruthless, invincible, immortal king in that agonizing moment. He looked like a devastated mortal man who had just been struck by a fatal blow. Why did you not tell me this before you tried to die? He asked, his voice rough, broken, and heavily strained with thick emotion. Because you are the king, I said bitterly, wiping a tear from my cheek. Kings simply take what they want and ask questions over the graves of their victims. Gideon reached out again, his large fingers hovering just an inch away from my wet cheek, physically trembling with suppressed emotion. I would violently tear down this entire kingdom stone by stone before I let it take your life, Eleanor, he vowed fiercely, his eyes burning with absolute conviction. If the royal crown itself is a death curse, then I swear to you on my soul, I will break the crown. The violent, screaming blizzard arrived just past midnight, howling relentlessly like a massive pack of wounded beasts against the thick stone towers of the winter spire. Despite Gideon's incredibly passionate, tear-filled vows in the glass conservatory earlier that evening, the sheer terror living inside my chest was an old, deep-rooted survival instinct that could not be easily erased by a few pretty words. Promises were entirely too easy for a powerful, desperate man to make in the heat of the moment, but actually breaking centuries of ancient, blood-soaked magic was an entirely different, seemingly impossible reality. Every single time I looked in the grand silver mirror in my chambers and saw the intricate silver mark growing noticeably brighter on my skin, I felt my precious time slipping rapidly and violently away. I knew the castle's intricate network of secret passages extremely well. My skilled ancestors had actually helped build the very architectural foundations of the Winter Spire centuries ago. While the castle guards were heavily distracted by the dangerously raging storm and the roaring, freezing winds, I slipped silently and quickly through a heavily embroidered tapestry hidden in the corner of the royal library. The narrow passage was completely pitch dark and smelled strongly of dry dust and old stone. But it led me directly down a winding staircase to a small, rusted iron gate located just outside the main defensive walls. The freezing, aggressive air hit me like a solid physical blow the second I stepped out into the blinding white, completely unforgiving northern wilderness. I wore only a relatively thin wool cloak thrown hastily over my emerald evening gown, my delicate, impractical shoes immediately sinking deep into the heavy, waist-high snowdrifts. I didn't know exactly where I was going in the darkness, only that my primal instincts screamed at me to put as much physical distance as possible between my fragile body and the king's intensely consuming magic. Within a single hour, the relentless, biting freezing wind successfully stole all the remaining comforting warmth from my fragile, exhausted limbs, making my desperate movements agonizingly sluggish and uncoordinated. My frantic breaths came in incredibly short, painful ragged gasps, the moisture literally freezing into sharp, tiny ice crystals before my face and brutally stinging my burning lungs. I stumbled awkwardly over a hidden, frozen tree root, falling heavily face first into a massive, deep snowdrift, my physical strength and sheer willpower completely and utterly spent. The comforting, seductive darkness began to rapidly close in around the blurry edges of my vision, bringing a surprisingly peaceful, intensely numbing sleep that promised a final, quiet end to all the frantic running and fear. Just as my incredibly heavy eyelids finally fluttered shut, ready to accept the cold embrace of death, a massive, terrifyingly large shadow violently broke through the thick, swirling curtain of falling snow. It was not a man walking upright on two legs, but a monstrous, breathtakingly huge great wolf, its thick fur as pristine and blindingly white as the storm itself, its massive eyes burning bright, unnatural gold in the darkness. Gideon had not foolishly followed me as a dignified, slow-moving king flanked by a loud army of guards. He had viciously tracked my scent as a desperate, terrified predator seeking to save his very life. Source. He shifted seamlessly and rapidly back into his tall human form, his normally confident, handsome face pale with a raw, devastating terror I had never once seen on his features before. He gathered my freezing, entirely unresponsive, stiff body firmly into his incredibly muscular arms, lifting me effortlessly from the icy, snowy grave I had foolishly dug for myself. He carried me swiftly and urgently into a nearby dark cavern, a naturally wind-shielded rocky shelter carved deep into the side of the towering mountain. Gideon quickly and aggressively stripped off his soaking wet, heavy cloak and immediately pressed his bare, burning hot chest firmly against my freezing, dangerously pale skin. The intense heat, violently radiating from his supernatural, lichened body was immense, feeling like a fierce, burning, magical current that slowly and painfully forced the deadly, paralyzing chill from my brittle bones. I began to shiver violently and uncontrollably, my faded consciousness returning in harsh, overwhelming waves of intense physical pain as the life-saving warmth finally took hold of my nervous system. "Why?" he roared softly, his deep voice incredibly thick with raw, agonizing emotion and unshed desperate tears as he held me impossibly tight against his racing, thundering heart. "Why do you continually keep running blindly into the jaws of death just to escape me? Because if I stay by your side in that castle, the magic will ensure I die anyway." I wept openly and bitterly against his warm neck, my trembling hands weakly clutching his broad, solid shoulders for support. "And if you manage to die out here in the ice because of me, I swear to the moon I will destroy myself without a single second of hesitation," Gideon whispered fiercely, his protective grip tightening until it almost bruised my ribs. "Do you not understand the absolute truth yet, my foolish Eleanor? The mate bond doesn't just pull me to you physically. It permanently binds my very immortal soul to yours. If the ancient magic of the crown is slowly killing you, then we are both already dead. I absolutely refuse to live another second in a world without the beautiful sound of your heartbeat." In that dark, freezing cave, looking up into his incredibly desperate, tear-filled golden eyes, the heavy iron wall I had built around my heart finally cracked and completely shattered. I realized with absolute clarity in that profound, life-altering moment that he was never my cruel captor, he was a deeply loving, devoted man, hopelessly trapped in the exact same tragic, magical web as I was. The final, ultimate conflict of our incredibly complicated, painful lives could not be solved by simply running away into the snow, nor could it ever be solved by hiding fearfully under rotting floorboards in the dark. The very next morning, the fierce, screaming blizzard finally cleared away entirely, leaving behind a breathtakingly peaceful world of brilliant, blinding white snow gently sparkling under the crisp, bright winter sun. Gideon did not carry me back up to my comfortable, luxurious bedroom in the eastern tower. Instead, he held my hand firmly and led me directly and purposefully deep into the ancient, winding catacombs located far beneath the castle's foundations. We walked silently and solemnly past the dusty, forgotten tombs of ancient kings and their tragic queens, until we finally reached a massive, circular chamber heavily sealed by giant, rusted iron doors. Inside the chilling, echoing room stood the infamous blood altar, an incredibly ancient, jagged, black stone structure visibly pulsing with the dark, heavy foundational magic of the entire Lycan kingdom. This terrifying monument was the true, undeniable source of the royal lineage, the terrible, blood-soaked relic that forcefully bound the Alpha King's immense, unnatural power directly to the northern lands and, tragically, to his fated mate. This exact spot is where the darkest, most unforgivable bargain in our long history was made over 5 centuries ago, Gideon said firmly, his voice echoing loudly as he smoothly drew a sharp, gleaming silver ceremonial dagger from his leather belt. The very first Alpha King selfishly demanded absolute, godlike power to supposedly protect his vulnerable people, and this dark altar forcefully took the precious vitality of his mates as the cruel payment. Gideon, what exactly are you planning on doing? I asked, a sudden, blinding wave of panic rising swiftly in my chest as he stepped purposefully and aggressively toward the ominously humming stone. I told you exactly what I would do last night in the cave, Eleanor. I refuse to be the powerful ruler of a kingdom that explicitly demands your precious life as a twisted, bloody sacrifice, he said without a single ounce of hesitation or regret in his voice. He turned back to look at me, his normally fierce golden eyes remarkably soft, incredibly tender, and filled with a profound, unshakable, peaceful certainty that completely took my breath away. If I destroy this cursed altar right now, the ancient royal magic will be permanently and irreversibly broken. I will instantly lose my divine strength. I will no longer be the absolute, all-powerful Alpha King. I will just be a normal, ordinary Lycan man. A simple, mortal man who loves you infinitely more than his own next breath. No, you cannot. I whispered desperately, stepping forward quickly to catch his strong, heavily muscled arm. Your people desperately need your incredible strength and protection. The massive northern pack will completely fall apart into chaos without a true king to guide them. Then let it fall into absolute ruin, he said fiercely, his deep voice terrifyingly steady, resolute, and completely unwavering. A legendary throne built secretly and selfishly on the hidden, forgotten graves of innocent, loving women is simply not a throne worth defending for another second. Before I could physically muster the strength to stop him, Gideon brought the dagger down and sliced the palm of his hand wide open, letting his rich, glowing royal blood spill directly onto the cold, ancient stone surface. The dark altar reacted instantly and violently, or incredibly deep, angry, blinding crimson light erupting forcefully from the jagged cracks in the black rock. A massive, terrifying wave of dark, oppressive energy quickly rippled outward through the circular chamber, making the solid stone walls violently tremble and intensely shake around us as if an earthquake had struck. Gideon gasped loudly in immense pain, dropping heavily and uncontrollably to his knees as the ancient, embedded magic painfully and aggressively tore itself completely away from his soul and his royal bloodline. I threw myself to the dirty floor beside him, wrapping my arms fiercely and tightly around his violently shaking shoulders, crying out his name desperately into the chaotic, deafening noise filling the room. With a final, incredibly deafening, thunderous crack that echoed for miles, the dark blood altar suddenly and completely shattered into 1,000 completely harmless, inert pieces of dull, ordinary grey stone. The incredibly oppressive, heavy magical weight that had terrifyingly hung over the castle and haunted my family's bloodline for centuries vanished completely into thin air in a single, glorious instant. I immediately looked down at my exposed collarbone with wide, disbelieving eyes, gasping loudly as I saw the bright, burning silver lunar mark rapidly and miraculously change right before my eyes. It was no longer painfully burning or aggressively glowing with consuming, dark magic. It had beautifully settled into a soft, faded, permanent white scar. It was now simply a beautiful, harmless mark of pure connection, completely free of the fatal curse, holding absolutely no dark power or threat over my precious life force. Gideon leaned heavily and exhaustedly against my shoulder, his breathing incredibly heavy and labored, his usually bright, piercing golden eyes much dimmer but completely clear, incredibly warm, and deeply full of life. He looked slowly up at my tear-stained face, a tired, genuinely beautiful, an entirely breathtaking smile breaking beautifully through his immense physical exhaustion. "It is entirely gone forever," he whispered hoarsely, pressing his sweaty, hot forehead affectionately and intimately against mine. "The dark shadow is completely dead and finally buried, my sweet Eleanor." I wrapped my trembling, delicate fingers carefully and lovingly around his deeply wounded hand, my warm tears of profound relief and overwhelming joy falling gently onto our joined, blood-stained palms. For the very first time since he had violently shattered those wooden floorboards right above my terrified head, I did not feel the slightest primal urge to run away from him. The terrifying, all-consuming conflict that had defined my entire existence was officially and permanently over. Completely destroyed by a selfless, extraordinary king who boldly and beautifully chose true love over a legendary crown. "I am right here," I whispered softly, leaning in and kissing his warm lips gently. Accepting our fated bond fully, completely, and without a single trace of fear remaining in my soul. "I am right here, Gideon, and I swear to you, I am never, ever going anywhere again."